Hello everyone, and welcome back to a new episode of Kerbal Space Program. The first thing you'll notice is that the mouse is moving around real fast. Well, it moved around real fast briefly. Anyway, the reason for this is that I recorded several episodes with the mic the wires were messed up, and basically there's no narration at all. And some cool stuff happened in those episodes. So I wanted to record some post-commentary, but not have to spend 2 whole hours post-commentating it. A lot of a normal video is just sort of watching me try to puzzle through things, and so there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make very interesting post-commentary. So we can get most of the content of what was happening in a much faster video. So this first one here, I was feeling a bit what's the word? A bit dejected. No, that's a bit too negative. A bit disappointed with how our previous explosive flights had gone, and decided to get back to testing something a little simpler. We have a contract that we've had just sitting around for a while, I think, to test this new largest solid fuel booster in flight above Kerbal, and I thought, how hard could that be? And it also says it's designed to be recaptured by parachutes after use, so I was like, that sounds great. Well, that one was a disaster. It turns out I started the rocket underground and it fell over, so that's not very great. List it up here, attach a thing to it. Glad I didn't put any Kerbals in the cockpit for this one. And so I actually reduced the amount of thrust this thing has, because I believe that this rocket all by itself could easily burn itself up in the atmosphere. I told it to thrust at like 50% and only fill up halfway with fuel. And even so, we got going real high. What I did not realize previously was that the altitude and velocity that we're supposed to test this rocket at is really slow. We have to get it to 12,000 meters and only be going 200 meters per second. That's pretty hard. So eventually, by the end of this episode, I think I do another test flight, and then I give up and say, forget that stupid contract. We learned some stuff here about, it turns out we're actually out of line of sight of any mission control facilities, and so we can't tell the unmanned probe to deploy its parachute. So that's an interesting lesson to have learned. So after we do one more test flight of this, and by the way, I never do get the solid rocket fuel to be recovered via parachute. I don't know what's going on. I can't get the parachutes to go off. I think what happens is it's just going too dang fast. Fast enough that it's not safe to deploy the main parachute. Or it burns up in re-entry because it's a little too aerodynamic or whatever. So anyway, this whole thing never really pans out. But it gives me a little bit of time to talk about something that I end up talking about much later in this series of 4 videos that I accidentally... really struggling to keep this under control. There's something near, I think, the beginning of the 3rd of 4 episodes here that I'm post-commentating that I spend several minutes talking about, several real-time minutes. And since we're watching, this video here is at 8x, because it's especially boring. I'm just launching a big needle straight up in the air and then trying to catch it, but failing. Yeah, as you can see, it really is just shaped like a lawn dart. I can't get it to do anything but point straight, and I can't even eject the thing in time. Okay, so then we give up on that contract and say, forget it. Let's take some tourist contracts. There are some tourists who want to do a flyby of the moon. There are some tourists who just want to get up into orbit around Kerbal. And I'm like, look, I've failed at enough things recently. Let's take some tourists into orbit. So that's what this next video that we're now starting here to provide post-commentary for. And we're watching it not at 8x speed. I think we're at 4x now, because a little bit more interesting stuff here happens. We look through the contracts, try to find something choice, something that we think we can do. And I also end up... Anyway, what I was saying a minute ago is I end up spending several minutes talking about orbital mechanics, KSP features, blah, blah, blah. And I need several minutes to do that in real time, which means that if I try to record it in post-commentary, I won't have enough time. So the stuff that happened in this episode is not really super crucial, so I'm just going to give you a little summary and maybe brief interjections when something of particular interest happens. But mostly, we're going to use this video to talk about the exposition that I will do in the next video. Or that I did in the next video and will be post-commentating in this video. It's a little complicated. It starts to sound a bit like time travel. But, so yeah, I'm looking at the scientific stuff that we need. I decided the next thing that I would really love to do is land on the moon. We have a contract for, like, planting a flag on the moon, and it would be great to meet that, but the contract expires before we get a chance to actually do it, I believe. We don't have the technology right now because we need better landing equipment and like RCS to give us enough control to deploy the landing gear and so on. And like plus, it's a difficult rocket to build. Not just like because I don't have the right parts, which I'm missing a couple, but I think I broadly have what I need. But I just don't have the right knowledge. I don't know how to properly build a moon lander or a rocket with one of its stages being a moon lander. I have some idea, but the details are all quite fuzzy, and I don't think I can do it yet. So it's good to get a bit more practice first anyway, which is why in this mission we're just going to in this episode rather, we're just going to take some tourists up into orbit for practice, basically. And also making sure that we can safely bring them to the moon when we choose to do that, because we do have a contract for that. Anyway, so the science that we want to unlock is we want to get like landing and space exploration or something like that are the two things we want. That'll give us a way to get a lander onto the moon once we've figured out how to build a rocket that can support such a large post-orbital stage. So that brings me to the stuff that I end up describing later on. Basically, a brief geometry lesson / orbital mechanics. Now, like, I'm not... there's an XKCD, which I would love to show you guys, but I can't really edit this video at the moment, of, Randall's graph of his understanding of orbital mechanics over time. And it's like, in undergrad, very little, and then sort of curving up, and then, like, when I got my postdoctorate degree in orbital physics or whatever crazy thing Randall did, it goes up a little bit, and then, like, watching stuff on NASA, it kind of goes up a little bit, and like playing Kerbal Space Program, and then there's this gigantic spike where suddenly it all makes sense. So my understanding of Kerbal Space of orbital dynamics does come completely from Kerbal Space Program, but it was not stuff that I have done. Like, I watched videos of Kerbal Space Program years ago, and sort of remember some of it from that. But so I noticed that we can upgrade the vehicle tracking center, and it will show you patched conics. And I didn't know what that meant. Patched conics. Conic certainly sounds to me like, oh, conic sections. And this is where we get into geometry. So here's a brief digression where I tell you why does the word conic sections mean anything to me, and why do I think it's related to Kerbal Space Program. Basically, when you are studying sort of a two-body problem, i.e. there are two objects in space somewhere, and by in space, I'm being very general. This includes like on Earth, somewhere in three-dimensional space, not necessarily the vacuum of space. So we're getting these tourists up into orbit. Seems fine. Nice round orbit, plenty of fuel left. Great. We don't need to celebrate. Let's get back to orbital mechanics. So say you're standing outside and you throw a ball up in the air. What path does that ball trace out on its way up and back down into your hand? It's a parabola. Wider or narrower, depending on how far you threw it, and taller or shorter, depending on how high you threw it, but that's the idea. It's a parabola of some kind. So what does this have to do with cones? Or really geometry? Like, isn't that sort of an algebra thing? Parabolas? Basically, I think it was the Greeks studied the motion of objects. Maybe it wasn't Greeks, maybe it was later, like Kepler and stuff. Who knows? But I think it was the Greeks. They loved geometry. The idea was, imagine a cone, like a traffic cone, but sort of a perfect geometrical cone, sort of sitting on a surface or something, but extending out infinitely. So I guess not sitting on a surface. At any rate, you then take a plane, an infinitely long in every direction, flat surface, and you slice it through the cone. Depending on where you slice it and what angle you slice it out, you can look at the places where the cone intersects with the plane, and those are sort of shapes, right? It turns out that there are sort of three main kinds of shapes you can get out of intersections like those, and that those shapes do a good job of describing the kinds of paths that objects in a two-body problem travel through. And remember, two-body problem is there's two things, like the ball that you threw and the Earth, or your space vessel and Kerbin, or the moon and Kerbin. Those are all sort of two-body problems, where one body is exerting a lot of force on the other one, basically gravitational force. So you can slice a cone with a plane, and one way to do it, you get a parabola. That's what happens when you throw something but not high enough to get into orbit, basically, right? You get a parabolic shape. Another way to slice a cone gets you an ellipse, or a circle, which is just a special case of an ellipse. And that's what happens when you get something that's actually in orbit, like we just had with these tourists. That was the heat shield exploding. Don't worry about it. Everyone's fine. You can get into an orbit where you just sort of never come down. You circle around. And that, again, is another conic section. They call it a section of a cone because it's where the plane slices through the cone, whatever. And the last one is you can sort of get hyperbolas, which is what you get when you're sort of at escape velocity, going too fast to be pulled into an orbit relative to a thing. And that's sort of what happened to us with Jeb going near the moon. He was sort of briefly in an orbit around the moon, but accelerated away from it in sort of a hyperbola kind of shape with regard to the moon. So those are the three ways you can get, like, kinds of orbits you can get out of conic sections. So back to upgrading this thing that lets you see patched conics. What is that all about? So the idea is, in real life, there's actually, like, having gravitational force applied on you from many, many different objects all the time. The moon, the sun, mostly the Earth, but also, like, the room you're in, your car down the street or whatever in the parking lot. They're all pulling on you, but not very hard. And so we can sort of simplify most of the time and imagine that it's just the Earth pulling on us. But really, of course, it's all these things all the time, just to greater or lesser degrees. Kerbal Space Program could simulate all of that, but it's rather expensive and error-prone to do. Errors sort of very small errors magnify into very large ones over time if you try to simulate everything. And so they make a simplifying assumption, which is that whatever thing is pulling on you the hardest at any given time, that's actually the only thing pulling on you. So they call that spheres of influence. As a brief aside, we're sort of futzing around with the orbital thing that we had here, trying to turn it into a thing that is good enough for getting to the moon again. I forget if I end up giving up on this and going back to the last thing we used to get to the moon. I think I do. But we put a tourist thing in here to, like, because we want to get tourists to the moon. That's our next job. But I eventually changed my mind and put in a science bay instead, because A, it would be great not to blow up any more tourists, and B, we can get some really great science from the moon. So that's basically all that's going to happen for the next several minutes, is building this ship, while I continue going on about conic sections. So, spheres of influence, right? The thing pulling on you the most is the only thing pulling on you at any given time in Kerbal Space Program. This lets them do some simplifying assumptions that get you very reasonable approximations of how things behave, without the sort of multiplying errors over time that you would get if you tried to simulate everything. And plus, it's much faster. So, a patched conic, the idea is, when you're in orbit around Kerbin, your orbit is described by an ellipse, i.e. one around Kerbin, right? And when your orbit sort of gets close to the moon, you suddenly transition from an ellipse around Kerbin to a hyperbola around the moon, because you're going, like, beyond escape velocity. You're going fast enough that you won't ever enter an orbit, so it's a hyperbola. And you can sort of take those two conic sections and find the one point of intersection, which is when you enter the moon's sphere of influence. And you can patch those two conic sections together to get a pretty good approximation of what your craft is going to do. And you could do this in your head, of course. Yeah, it looks like I did revert back to the one that went to the moon before. You could do this in your head, but it's pretty hard, and we eyeballed it when we flew Jeb to the moon last time, and it didn't work out that great. But with patched conics, the game will actually show you, oh, you're about to enter the sphere of influence of the moon at this time, you know, all this great stuff, and you can actually see what your real path is going to be. So that was something I was really excited to upgrade. And if you also upgrade mission control, you get flight planning, the ability to say, I want my target to be the moon, and then you get like feedback about what your orbit is like with respect to the moon. And importantly, you can set maneuvers where you plan ahead of time. I want to burn by this much at this point in my orbit, and the game will actually show you, well, here's what your orbit will turn into if you do that. And you can make adjustments to it, say I want to burn more or less or earlier or whatever. And that will help a lot with getting to the moon. So that's the idea with patched conics. Okay, great. Now we're actually flying. I believe this is the flight where we try to get to the moon. Lost those boosters. The parachutes never really did work out. And by the way, we're watching this one now at, I think, 3x speed. It's more exciting than the last two were, which we watched at 8x and 4x. And we're also pitching over to the horizontal a lot sooner than we were in previous flights. That was something I stumbled across when looking up patched conics. Someone saying, help, how do I get in orbit? And people were like, you should tip over sooner. So fine, I did that, and it seems to help. We kept having a problem right before where we would get our orbit up pretty, you know, to 80,000 or whatever, and then we would try to turn sideways and widen our orbit. But and we could do it, but we spent a lot of fuel from our orbital stage to do so. And what? And it ended up sending our apoapsis really high to be thrusting so much near. Geez, that sounds a little suggestive. But to be burning so much fuel while we're already kind of past our apoapsis, fixing a problem we had made. So this time we get into a circular orbit with much less expenditure of fuel. And we have a ton of fuel left to do. Now we're doing, look, all these exciting maneuvers. I'm saying, like, look, game, I want to get to the moon. And by the way, our orbit is really quite nice. We're only inclined like 2% or 2.9% or something. Pretty good. We're almost equatorial. And with regard to the moon, so now that I set the moon as our target, it's showing me, in addition to apoapsis and periapsis, it's showing these ascending and descending nodes. Those are the parts of your orbit where the plane of your orbit intersects with the plane of your target. So it's basically, if you want to get to one of those two places, you can. That's the best place to adjust the inclination of your orbit higher or lower. And I think with an inclination of like just 2.8%, I think we would be fine not doing any adjustment burns. But we have a lot of spare fuel, and I could use some practice for when we've had less successful launches adjusting our orbit. So I decided to go ahead and do this anyway. And so you see we've set up like a maneuver. And you can pull on it in any of the 6 directions to say, I want to burn this much away from the planet, or prograde, or retrograde, or towards the planet, or perpendicular, parallel to the surface. So parallel to the surface is what's called our normal and anti-normal burns, and that's what we're going to do at our, I think we're heading towards our ascending node? Maybe it's descending, I can't really tell. Looks like it's ascending and we're fixing it to become a little flatter, yeah. So the game, we say, here's how much I want to burn, and the game tells you, okay, well, you're going to be at orbit inclination of 0 if you do that, and I'm like, great. And it puts a little marker on your nav ball saying this is the direction to point, here's how long you said you wanted to burn. And it figures out, like, you don't actually tell it how long you want to burn. You say, I want to exert this much change in velocity. And based on how much thrust your engine can provide, it tells you how long to burn for to get that much change in velocity. And so now our orbit is nice and flat, just about parallel with the orbit of the moon. And I can put in an encounter here saying I want to burn prograde to lengthen my apoapsis. And it says, okay, well, you'll get over there towards the orbit of the moon. But I'm having quite a bit of trouble at this stage in the video figuring out when to make this burn, because we can definitely get to the orbit of the moon, but the question is, like, we want to get there at the same time as the moon does. And just then, like, I briefly intersected with the moon, but then I like pulled on the wrong knob or something and did some crazy burn and had to cancel and start over. But there we go. So it's now like sort of patched together our ellipse around Kerbin with a hyperbola around the moon, and says, here's how close you'll be when you approach, here's where the moon will be when you approach, here's when you're going to leave. And it's like saying all this amazing, awesome stuff, and I'm trying to plot things out so that I get as close to the moon as possible. Ends up, like, being kind of hard. I struggle with it a bit. I think I eventually, at the end of this, have a better mastery of how this whole system works. But it takes a bit of a struggle to figure out when to do this. So, by the way, this has all been going pretty quickly at this 3x speed, right? I'm sure you guys are not really picking up all the details of what's going on. And it is a shame that I wish you guys could be with me on that journey of exploration where I kind of figure out how to apply the theoretical knowledge I have from watching videos of Kerbal Space Program to how to actually point a spaceship in the direction I want it to go. This is sort of a summary of my knowledge that I'm giving here, and I'll try to, next time we're up in space doing maneuvers with proper audio recording, I'll go through it more slowly and explain in more detail. Here, I have to talk pretty fast to keep up with myself, honestly. And it looks like I've found a good time to do a maneuver that'll get me to catch up to the moon over that way. And yeah, indeed, I'm basically saying, well, time to end this episode. We're headed to the moon, but we'll do that at the beginning of the next episode, is what I'm saying right now. That's why nothing's moving on the screen. But you guys are still strapped in for this long post-commentary ride, where I describe everything at 3 times speed. And we're back! Amazing! So we have our burn all planned out. And it says we're going to get to the moon, and that's great. How long are we burning there for? It's kind of small. Like, is that 400 or... It's like 800, right, meters per second? The video preview while I'm narrating is pretty small, so it's a little bit fuzzy for me. Anyway, so we figured out how we need to burn for, I think, a minute or so. Yeah, but we want to go all the way around the planet first. And I spent some time thinking about this, like, geez, isn't the moon going to have moved if we wait all the way until we're on the other side of the planet? Yes, but, like, not really. Our orbit is, like, 10 minutes, and the moon's orbit is a month. So we're much closer to Kerbin, and therefore orbiting it much more quickly, which means us waiting for one orbit doesn't really make much difference as far as the moon is concerned. A little, but not much. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to lengthen our orbit as we've planned in the burn and head over towards the moon. Notice, by the way, how fast we're going right now. Oh, and it puts a little maneuver marker on your nav ball saying, this is the direction you said you wanted to burn in, so point there. If we get a more advanced pilot, we can actually have him use SAS to keep yourself pointed at the maneuver node instead of pointed at prograde or retrograde. But it doesn't really matter because we actually just want to burn prograde. It's just that we anticipate that by the time we get to the maneuver, this is where prograde will be. So anyway, we are headed towards the moon, and yeah, oh great, we're burning, very exciting. So you can watch the orbit lengthen gradually and sort of start to get quicker and quicker. Remember we were going like about 2,000 meters per second, and we're now going like about 3,000 meters per second with respect to Kerbin. I think we overshot it a fair bit. Our orbit, notice the orbit we actually have doesn't look that much like what the maneuver node was going to say, I think. Or maybe, oh right, this wider purple orbit is like, once you have, cause we're going to go encounter the moon, and its gravity is going to change what happens to us a little bit. And so we will no longer be on the same orbit around Kerbin as we are now, because the moon will have thrown us off course a bit. And so this purple orbit is predicting, I believe, what'll happen once we're done slingshotting around the moon. our periapsis around Kerbin will have raised quite a bit. But notice we were moving like 3,000 meters per second when we were near Kerbin, and as we get further and further away, our velocity is going way down. Right, where are we now? It looks like 700 meters per second. Is a little hard to read. Forgive me if I'm wrong. And I seem to recall that by the time we get to the moon, our velocity is like 200 meters per second. Not very far at all with respect to Kerbin. But with respect to the moon, we're traveling awfully quickly, which is why it's not going to be able to pull us into orbit. Oh, and here I'm admiring, like, look, the planet and the moon look about the same size from the cockpit, and the moon looks about the same, or the sun looks about the same size too. It's all like pretty cool. We're at a spot where all the celestial bodies look roughly similar. And I pop in here briefly to look at Jeb's view and show off the SAS, and like you actually can control the ship from inside of it. There's a little nav ball in there you can use if you want to imagine how things are for Jeb. Or in this case, what's his name? Not Jeb, but something Bald. His name has Bald in it? Diebald? I don't know, something. Anyway, and so now we're actually in the moon's sphere of influence. And so while it's still showing us our orbit around Kerbin, it's also showing us the only thing actually exerting gravitational force on us right now, which is the moon. It's showing us a hyperbolic orbit where we're just going to fly right by the moon. And I'm grabbing all this science from high over the moon. Yeah, observe the mystery goo, get a crew report, get an EVA report, open up the science bay thing that we have, get science out of that. So much juicy science. Amazing. And it turns out that this stuff says it's from orbit high above the moon or something like that. I couldn't read it. It went by pretty quick. You guys probably... Oh, well, I guess it's going just as fast for you guys. It's just bigger. Anyway, it's from high orbit above the moon. So this gives me an idea that we should visit the moon and go into a low orbit around it and get more science, which I wanted to do anyway, but we'll do it some later episode. So anyway, here I'm demonstrating, look, if we were to burn at our periapsis with regard to the moon, our apoapsis with regard to the moon, we could bring our periapsis down so that we actually enter a circular or elliptical orbit. And then if we wanted to, we could, at our new periapsis, perform another burn to lower our apoapsis and go into like a circular orbit around the moon. But we don't actually want to do that. We still just want to fly by. But that's sort of what the flight plan for a future episode is going to look like. And it doesn't cost that much extra fuel to do that, because the moon is just such a small thing. Getting into an orbit around it is less work, I think. I'm not sure. I think I looked and it wasn't going to be that much fuel, but I don't remember. Anyway, so what we want to do though is when we go back to Kerbin, our periapsis is like 500 kilometers up, really high, way out of the atmosphere. And so to get back, oh, I'm now struggling with the camera. I found out that I can point the camera at something else other than the ship, and now I can't get it back to the ship. I can only stare at the moon or Kerbin or something. Anyway, I end up saving and quitting and loading to fix it because I can't find it in the camera controls. There's a thing here that says double middle click on your ship to recenter the camera on it, but that doesn't seem to work, so I don't know. Anyway, saving and loading worked. So what we're doing is at our apoapsis from Kerbin, which happens to be sort of near the moon, but that's not important. Our speed is going to be not very high at all, a few hundred meters per second. And so we can apply just a very small retrograde burn. Retrograde? Yeah, retrograde burn. Of like, to decrease our velocity further by like 40 meters per second or something, which will have a dramatic impact on our orbit around Kerbin, bringing the periapsis much closer for a very small amount of fuel. And so that's how we're going to re-enter, basically. We're going to get our periapsis closer to Kerbin, so that we are close enough. Anyway, get our periapsis close to Kerbin so that we don't just fly by it again. And then once we're in a low orbit around Kerbin, we will burn retrograde again to bring our Kerbin apoapsis down The plan is to circularize the orbit that way by first lowering our periapsis, and then once we're there, lowering our apoapsis to get back into a circular orbit like the one we left in. And we have, I think, a fair amount of fuel to do this with, as it turns out. Yeah, here I finally give up on the camera and save and load, and it's fine. Yeah, so what is our velocity right now? Like 200 meters per second. Yeah, and we're going to slow it down by 43. So that's like cutting our velocity into like a quarter of what, well, by a quarter to like 3/4 of what it was, basically. Humongous impact for a small amount of fuel. That's a cool thing about orbital mechanics. Depending on where you are, the amount that you burn can make a much bigger or much smaller difference. Because it's really based on like the percentage of your current velocity that you change things by. So if you're moving very slowly, then a small increase in quantity is a very large increase in percentage, or decrease, similarly. So anyway, the idea is to now, I think we're getting ready to burn here. Not quite there yet, but yeah, we've got the maneuver all planned out. We're going to bring our periapsis at Kerbal. Oh yeah, there it goes. Blink and you missed it. That was our whole burn to get back home. We're trying not to lower it back into the atmosphere just yet, because I don't want to go straight from the moon to re-entering. Like, that would be at least 3,000 meters per second, I think. That's pretty darn fast. That's why I decided to regularize the orbit on the way in. Or once we have arrived in. I'm actually putting in a maneuver there to say, let's test what it would look like once I do that. Is, you know, I've planned out a maneuver that is going to circularize our orbit. And it's only going to cost like a minute's worth of fuel to do that. And we have, I don't know, a couple minutes of fuel, maybe? Enough that we should be able to afford this. But there's sort of a twist that is more impactful than I had realized when I started this maneuver, which is that this maneuver is planned assuming, or imagining, that you can dump all of your fuel in an instant. Right at the maneuver node, dump all of that fuel. That's how much velocity we would like to shed. And if we do that instantly, this is what our orbit will look like. But in practice, we can only apply thrust so quickly. And that's why the burn lasts for more than, you know, a nanosecond, because you have to apply your fuel gradually. So here we are, we're burning, and it's adjusting our apoapsis, which is great. But I stop early because I realize, wait a minute, it's also messing with our periapsis. If we were burning exactly at periapsis, I believe that no amount of fuel we spent could change what our periapsis is. But we're not. We're slowing down our craft right before periapsis, which means that we're lowering our periapsis. And so we're actually going to go ahead and we're re-entering right now. we didn't do what I wanted to do of circularizing the orbit. We would have to be able to burn more quickly to do that, or maybe as gradually as we did, but at a different time, by a different amount, something. We'd have to do something different. I'm now admiring like the Milky Way and the moon and all this. So once I realized that we had that we were going to re-enter whether I liked it or not, I decided to spend the rest of our fuel burning retrograde. This does reduce our apoapsis, but that doesn't matter because we're never actually getting to apoapsis again. The important thing is that it burns off as much as possible of our excess velocity so that the heat shield doesn't have to do as much work on re-entry. And our pilot here, oh, Neilbald, right? That's what his name is? Anyway, did a great job of keeping things pointed retrograde the whole way in, so we weren't in a ton of danger on the way, and we succeeded at doing a flyby of the moon. Everything was really well under control. I thought this mission went great. It wasn't totally perfect, but it was very good. And we got a ton of science out of it. I don't talk very long about the science at the end of the real pre-recorded episode, which means I don't have long to talk about it. I have even less time to talk about it at 3x speed. So briefly, we got like 100-something science, which means we're at like 190-something, 180-something, which is enough to research those two 90 science nodes that we wanted to get in order to enable us to land on the moon, once we figure out how. We have the technology anyway. And got 2 experience, hooray! We got some milestone things for returning from a flight to the moon. Okay, so actually, welcome back. It turns out I was talking and I ran out of video to record over. The stuff I was post-commentating ended and I got cut off. Remarkably, I got cut off like in between sentences, so if you blinked, you might miss the video transition. And the audio didn't clip. But anyway, we did I didn't really have a lot more to say. Just we got some science, we came back from the moon, we finished up a contract, I think. Maybe. I don't know. Got some money anyway. And in the next episode, we'll, I think, head up to the moon again, do some more like low moon orbit science, maybe do some touristy contracts, who knows. But I just wanted to make sure to come back and add in a little section at the end of the post commentary here to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.